All right. It is my pleasure to welcome for the first time on Bad Faith podcast, Professor Rob Larson. He is a professor of economics at Tacoma Community College and the author of Bit Tyrants, The Political Economy of Silicon Valley and Capitalism versus Freedom, and the book I have in my hand, which I was so glad to read, called Mastering the Universe, The Obscene Wealth of the Ruling Class, What They Do with Their Money, and Why You Should Hate Them Even More. Welcome to the pod.
Thanks, Brianna. My pleasure.
I'm curious why you chose to write this specific book. I think many people who listen to this podcast are very familiar with this sort of 99 versus 1% language that came out of the Occupy Wall Street movement and then was further popularized by the Bernie 2016 and 2020 campaigns. In fact, just last week, he put out a statement inveighing against the growing wealth gap at a moment when I think it's very welcome, but at which time many people are thinking, well, why now, after you have just sort of spent an election cycle throwing your rhetorical weight and your substantive political weight behind a candidate that very much is bought into the systems of inequity that are criticized in his statement and in your book. So, for you, why now the choice to write this book?
Yeah, well, I mean, writing the book is just based on what we're all seeing every day, which is we have all these twisted problems in the world right now, and I mean, you can pick the issue, but it all does tend to trace back to that same very small, very thin elite of households that we have in the U.S. and around the world that kind of have that power in the literal sense of just being the decision makers. They're the ones that decide what giant companies will invest in and where they're going to move their production to. And they staff a lot of the legislative and other wings of the government, and they get to help move the agenda there. And above all, these guys own the media empires that we struggle to survive on, as we're all aware of. So to me, like, the why of the book is just like all of these problems we have now: world huge floods, fires, giant horrible wars. Like, all of this stuff is for the benefit of just a tiny number of really wealthy families and households. So that, and certainly the election too, as they all are these days, which are sort of elite spending offs. That also kind of was a spur to get this stuff on the record before the poll.
So for people who missed it, Bernie's statement was titled News, Sanders' Statement on Oligarchy in America. And it starts off, this is what an oligarchy looks like. Today, while 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, 3 multi-billionaires own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. Today, we have a greater concentration of ownership than we have seen since the Gilded Age in sector after sector: financial services, healthcare, agriculture, transportation, energy, food, housing, etc. Fewer and fewer giant corporations control what is produced and the prices we pay. I mentioned that many of us who are, listeners to this podcast are familiar with the economic disparities afoot. I will say, though, that your book was especially compelling in wrangling a large volume of sort of inequity indicia together to paint a really galling picture of how bad things are. So for those who haven't yet picked up your book, can you give us a sense of what we're really contending with here?
No, for sure, Brianna. Yeah. And, as you say, there is like a fair amount to think about on this subject. But the bit I always just like to cut straight to is just the shares of national wealth and just who has that, who has the assets, who has the wealth of our big capitalist economy. And counting everything together, cash and real estate and financial portfolios and so on. The very short version is if we look at, again, that richest 1% of US households by wealth, just going with them as sort of a standard benchmark people know. The last number we have from 2022 had them owning about 35%. That single percentage of households owns 35% of the national wealth. And of course, this was a few years ago. The number will be higher now and will be increasing with the new administration next year. So a gigantic amount. It's not quite the estimates we have of how much money they held during the Gilded Age, kind of the peak of world capitalism before the New Deal and taxes and regulations and big labor movements and stuff like that. But 35% for that richest 1 in 100 is a stupendous, outrageous number that everyone should be thinking about when they're doing their job and calculating how little they're getting paid per hour in their minds. So to me, that's the real thing. I mean, income inequality is important. but it's a sort of smaller number because everyone has to earn their basic income. But it's the wealth that decides who's in a position to make those decisions that we talked about at the beginning. What will be invested in by the business world and what the economy of tomorrow is going to look like, and certainly what the economic policy will be at the state level. So to me, that's kind of the most single compelling number. And I should mention, I get this data mostly from the World Inequality Database, which is a great project that I want to just mention. People should check out their website. It's really good. But maybe the last thing to say in connection with just these numbers is specifically something I was trying to draw attention to, which is just the issue of concentration of the specific form of wealth that is stock ownership and the ownership of the equity, these shares that make up ownership of corporations. So if you own a share of Amazon, you own a tiny piece of it and you get a tiny piece of its profitability. Well, again, if we look at those richest 1% of households, from the research we have access to, the last estimate was that they own 40% of all the traded stock in the United States. The top 10% own 84% of the stock, most of it. So when we see corporate profits and the market blowing up these days with the Trump victory, like that benefits, if you have a middle class pension like me or a retirement fund, you get a few pennies out of that. But that mostly goes to those rich households that own so much of those shares. So I think those are the kind of numbers people should be sort of aware of.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, ever since the election and arguably even before, we've been embroiled in this discourse about, why the normies, why the regular folks, why the voter doesn't understand how good the economy is. And of course, the evidence of how good they have it is that people are pointing to stock market successes. And you make 2 points in the book. One, which you just explained, which is that a very small percentage of people have an investment in the stock market to begin with, but also a big chunk of those who are in the bottom 90% who are invested in such a smaller proportion, so incrementally, that it also isn't especially material, and that the bulk of wealth for the working classes is in home ownership and not in stocks. And so we're all being told to buy into and invest in and kind of psychologically and emotionally invest in outcomes that have very little to do with our real lives. That being said, I do wonder what your take is on this broader kind of discourse that's been happening about whether or not the election results are a sort of another it's the economy's stupid moment where the Democrats really dropped the ball on talking about income inequality and more specifically policies that could close the gap.
Yeah, I think that's a incredibly relevant question. And that's kind of, I think, a perceptive way of putting it. Like the normies, what is their problem? And yes, this whole wonderful discourse it was to watch over the fall of people saying, it's a vibe session. It's the economy's good. People just don't get how good it is. Just about the most smug and patronizing attitude you can really imagine. And, a lot of economists I even like Dean Baker or, Paul Krugman does some good editorials when he's not supporting the Clinton administration and stuff. They were fast to say this too. And it was always, look how good the stock market is, or more specifically, especially for the economists, it's look how great GDP is, the economy. GDP, just the total value of everything the economy produces in a year, the size of an economy, we call that. Like it's growing under Joe Biden, just great growth. So, you're getting richer. And guys like, that idiot Stancil would try to be more sophisticated than this because, of course, like GDP, when the economy grows, that's just growth in production of goods and wealth. Like you don't necessarily get any of it. GDP per capita just is kind of the standard measure of wealth of a country. And it's just the whole production divided by the number of human beings. So if every man, woman, child, and prisoner got the same exact amount of money, it would be this much. It's not useless, but it's pretty limited as a data point. So Stancil would try to be more sophisticated and go to, like median wages or something like that, which still only tell you so much. Just working so hard to avoid admitting that when people have been suffering from class warfare for 30 years and discovering from the economy that they are considered abjectly disposable as industry after industry goes overseas and gets replaced by competitive new industries like tech that requires a degree or the fast-paced fentanyl selling field. These people, like, they react politically, and it's not in a way that says, I'd like more status quo. Like, people see Trump as a change agent, which is misguided, and the change that there is will be bad. But people like seek that, and it's true. Like when people are having the economy sucks moment, you have to respect that, even if objectively the person they'll end up voting for is going to be against like many of their interests. Like many of those new Trump voters are, plenty of bitter liberals online are saying, "Oh, wait till you get deported." Biden to Trump Hispanic family
Yeah.
member. It's like, oh, what a mistake they made. Clinton knew to run on something that looked like an economic platform for all of his evil, and Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris decided that you could just get by on just anything but an economic program, mostly tacking to the right. I mean, we all suffered through the campaign. We don't need to revisit it further. But that disconnect between people looking at nice economic statistics and saying, oh, so the working class must love that too. Suffering from all that class warfare, when inflation happened, it was just a brutal experience for these households, and they wanted to throw out the bums. Just so happened the bums were Joe Biden and his weak sauce protege. So here we are.
You spent some time sort of analyzing the role that COVID played. Of course, the sort of corporate media discourse is that COVID welfare programs drove inflation. It was that inflation that working people felt and then punished Biden for. And now the right is making the argument that, of course, we have to reverse those policies in order to return us to the halcyon days of a 2017 economy. What's your read on that?
Yeah, and this is a big contentious area among my people that we economists will be debating and picking over the data from for many years. I assure you. Uh, because inflation had been sort of strained for 40 years, a lot of people is just a strange, scary new phenomenon too. And undoubtedly, I mean, we had a natural disaster. We had a major epidemic because public health and vaccines work so well. We haven't had one of those in 100 years. Like a major society disrupting level pandemic like this. With the Spanish flu in the 1910s, and so people are kind of psychologically unprepared for that and want to create all these controversies. Like COVID was enough of an emergency to kill over 1 million Americans. I'm old enough to remember when we destroyed Iraq and Afghanistan because of 9/11, an unrelated event that killed 3,000 Americans. Now it's, COVID. That was just a government conspiracy. Amazing to see that. But that COVID aspects are the main thing that drove inflation. So sure, you have the big growth in incomes that came with the COVID welfare measures, including with that doubling of unemployment benefits by St. Bernard, of course. But additionally, like the specific events of how the economy is reopened, I would say, are at least as important as that. We, the big consumption economy, opened before China, our big supply economy, in terms of many of those categories of merchandise that are about to get more expensive under the new administration. And that meant a bunch of demand that couldn't be fulfilled, which is a big inflation driver when you have that demand gap. So that contributes in addition to those welfare measures. And it amazes me, the third thing, really with that big inflation wave, you've got the COVID welfare, which because it was significantly raised working class incomes in this country, which are so low, those sturdy welfare benefits drove a big boost in their consumption. And that's more demand, which pushes up prices. So did our reopening before China. But the third bit is one that's purely a creature of policy, which was sanctioning Russian oil after their invasion of Ukraine in 2022. We invade countries all the time in the West. We can do that. Like, that's cool. Russia invades a country. Oh my God, you monsters. Where do you get the idea you can invade a country? So we sanction every export they have. We seize their wealth. We seize their billionaires' wealth, which is a fun story. I talk about that in the book. But like that's significant because that drove up global energy prices in the West, and higher energy prices mean higher prices for everything. I mean, that was the main driver in the 70s energy crisis, our last big inflation wave itself. So you really have three separate forces, two of them COVID related, that drove that giant inflation wave. Of course, the right wing and the corporate world is going to use this as a stick to bash progressive and left wing redistribution ideas till the end of time. But, Sanders, a lot of people owe Sanders a debt because he got them like a real money benefit at a really scary time when many people couldn't work, even though, of course, those working class people, so disposable even a year before, were now essential workers. So you're essential, meaning you have to go out and risk your lives, even though we've been just trying to find out how much we can lay you off in the past. So using the stuff and pinning it all on the welfare measures is a predictable but very flimsy way of understanding the inflation of the last few years.
I mean, another part of it that you talk about in the book is just what percentage of uh, stimulus money ended up going to the top echelons of society. And I think it's important to really nail that down. I think I was having a debate with, maybe it was when I was talking to Michael Eric Dyson recently, but this issue came up where oftentimes the COVID stimulus is held out as evidence of Biden's progressivism, but it's a double-edged sword. The extent to which more could have been done is erased with that sort of a narrative, and the extent to which the programs were not designed sufficiently well to benefit the bulk of the people that are now being blamed for the problem of inflation, all makes this a very messy analysis. So I think I was trying to make the case, I believe it was to Michael Eric Dyson, about the disproportionate benefit to the rich of the American Rescue Plan, and we were having a bit of a debate about it. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity also to sort of unpack that for us a little bit. How much did billionaires benefit from the COVID pandemic?
Oh yeah, it's a really interesting question, and yeah, people have done like a lot of good dissection on that policy. Like to me, the thing I always think of, you know, a lot of arms to those COVID, you know, public support bills, but one of the main ones was the PPP, which was one of the main programs that people refer to in this kind of discussion, right? The Paycheck Protection Program, and it makes some sense. It's rather than have everyone get on unemployment, enhanced or not, way easier just to have people stay in their jobs and keep collecting their paychecks. We pay the businesses. The idea of that is then when we reopen, it's easier because you don't have to rehire people or do new job searches. You just kept your existing people. So it had some logic to it. But of course, it's all loans that are forgivable. We can't just give out aid. Like it's anything to avoid that. So what they did was those PPP loans, you had to go through like the mega banks. You had to apply for those. And that's a big bureaucratic process. A lot of small firms don't want to do it. They'd rather just lay off the staff, especially now that unemployment's higher. It's easier on their conscience. But those larger firms are the ones, of course, that have the expertise and the time and the staff to see, oh, how can this be gamed in some way? What business do I have that I can claim all these workers? And the amount of fraud in PPP is like significant. But as always, you know, people want to say fraud. Oh, it's the thing those poor people do, claiming extra welfare checks or voting twice or something. It's always like your big guys at the top who have the time and the kind of mental inclination just to be opportunistic and find those moments where they can scam the system in some way. But you're right. Like the main people who are being blamed for this are just the working class people in the society who really needed that supplemented unemployment benefits and all those other numerous welfare measures. So, like, of course, every part of the reaction to this will be to try to belittle any success story for social democratic policy, which, you know, for all of the drawbacks of our COVID response, and I wouldn't say it's some big testament to Joe Biden, who, I mean, a lot of history to be written on that particular gentleman, but it does show like we cut child poverty in half for a few years using that policy. I mean, that's just a social democratic success story. So, of course, the main story must be, oh, you know, billionaires benefited. Oh, this caused inflation. Just anything to delegitimize yet another success story for social democratic policy.
Yeah, I do wonder what you make of this fact that post-election, you could make the argument that much unlike the post-2016 election, at least some corporate media figures seem to be entertaining the idea that Bernie was right about some stuff. Maybe this is a good time to react to one of these clips. Maybe Armand, the one that has Hassan Piker in the corner, the Bakari Sellers clip.
Bakari, what do you think of all that? What Hassan Piker was telling Donnie?
I wish he was paying attention. I mean, it's patently absurd.
Yeah, he's right. I wasn't paying attention. I don't know what I'm talking about. Well, it seems to me like Bakari Sellers is not a fan of mine.
To say that he wishes that Kamala Harris would adopt some populist economic policies. Was he talking about the fact that she wanted to build 3 million new homes?
That you misunderstood, my friend. You and I have very different understandings of what left populism looks like. If you think a private-public partnership and deregulating the housing sector is left economic populism, well, that's why you keep losing, Bakari. That's why the party keeps losing. It's not I that hasn't been paying attention. It's you, my friend. Nah, that's fine. That's fine. We should just keep doing this shit over and over again. Honestly, this is good stuff.
With housing tax credits, or was he talking about the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit?
I like that everything that he suggested is a tax cut, by the way. When you think about where the Democratic Party is now and the economic messaging that they have, 40 years ago, like this would be considered the right-wing position. That's what's so crazy about it. Like it's all tax credits and deregulation. Is all tax credits and deregulation is tax cuts. Like that is crazy. That's crazy that this is like, you don't understand. Kamala Harris is talking about the opportunity economy. That's left populism. It's like, no, it's not. And the reason why these guys, I can't tell if Bakari Sellers here is just like genuinely lying on purpose. Like he knows better, but he's still lying. Or if he's just oblivious because he has never encountered someone in his immediate vicinity that goes, what are you talking about? Like no one thinks this is cool.
So Rob, I see a lot of nodding and smiling as Hassan Piker took on Bakari Sellers' response to Hassan Piker on Pod Save America on the mainstream news there. Go ahead and give your response, not just to Hassan Piker's analysis, which it seems to be agreed with, but with the takeaway that people like Bakari Sellers have been running with post-election.
Yeah, well, I mean, inevitably, every losing political side has a bunch of ass covering and so on. But this is kind of especially weak sauce. I mean, watching these guys talk after the fact, like they ran, for example, Obama's 2008 campaign, which had all these liberal and left-wing promises about codifying Roe and passing card check and all this stuff, and then coming into office and going, it's no longer a priority. We're not going to do any of that stuff. But at least he ran on it. And with his charisma, you get, by today's standards, a landslide victory, bigger than the one Trump just pulled off, as painfully decisive as that one was. But like claiming that any kind of populist policy campaign got run is just amazing. I mean, it's always like, well, let me remind you of her policy to cut taxes on this. I mean, to the extent there was economic policy, it was copying Trump, like saying, oh, I also would like to cut taxes on tips. And Social Security benefits. Just, of course, yeah, it's all just tax cut policy, but just copying what Trump is doing is like the weakest look I can imagine. And then speed running the Clinton campaigning with Cheney rather than, say, Sean Fain of the United Auto Workers. Similar mistakes that were very painful, I think, for us all to watch happen there. So I think Piker's got a pretty good grip on that. But just the tendency is to say during the campaign, shut up socialists, shut up the left. We're the professionals. You idiots don't know how to do anything. We will succeed. And it's nothing. There's just zero economic policy. Like they'll do anything but run on economic policy because that bothers the donors. And if you do that, how are you going to raise the $1.4 billion that we know that they spent on that useless campaign? And of course, lots of other disadvantages there. Be fair to Harris, really late start to the campaign, no primary. I mean, she never should have been the candidate in the first place. Obviously, this is mainly all Joe Biden's responsibility. But it's an amazing thing, especially with some of these Harris team members saying, and credibly sounding at least so far, that their own internal polling never showed her ahead. That's amazing because, of course, during the campaign, as we all just watched, they spent the campaign telling us to shut up. We're going to cost them the election with our popular left-wing policies, telling her to adopt those. And I mean, after all, what was the big story in the election? Everyone's talking realignment. I think de-alignment's a little more accurate. But like large chunks of the working class are deserting the Democrats 30 years after the Democratic Party deserted them with NAFTA and all the other policies that party has adopted to alienate the working class. And in 2016, it was the white working class. And then in 2024, it's the broader working class. That was how Sanders put it, which I think is a very thoughtful, more or less accurate reading of it. So like the Hispanic working class voters, who was strong with them? I mean, that was the basis of Bernie's successes in 2020, Nevada, of course, but then Texas and California, significant primaries to win. And it was all through his strength with that, multiracial working class coalition, as people like to pretend to support. So watching everyone look down their nose at the left during the campaign and telling us to shut up, and then saying, we actually knew we were going to lose with our right-wing no policy campaign all along. I mean, these people should be driven out of the public sphere, in my opinion. It's amazing to see their lack of contrition. And well, of course, if you go to her website, there's tax cuts. Like this is people are feeling inflation. You need to say you will get a job and your dad will get a free house. Like that would have been the chance to get around Trump this time. And again, it's the opposite of the campaign that was run.
Yeah, it's funny. It's the Bakari. The Bakari and his cohort line is like, we were doing populism. Actually, you just weren't paying close enough attention. But there is this other like
again, the voter mistake, our mistakes. I'm sorry, Master, that we and the voters failed you.
Exactly. But there has been this almost more confusing to me cohort, and maybe we can play this Chuck Todd clip, Armand, where he seems to be saying sort of largely what we've been saying, that, exactly to your point about Barack Obama at least running on a populist message, even though he betrayed those promises, and having the charisma to go along with it was a successful strategy. And why aren't Democrats even trying to replicate that? Tell me what you make of this.
I do think they need to figure out how to get back to their first principles of being a working party. And arguably, I think it turns out Barack Obama began this turn in the wrong direction when he put his arm around Hillary Clinton and sort of picked a side, the establishment versus the populist wing. Well, the populist wing of his movement went over to Bernie Sanders, and then a quarter of those people went from Bernie to Trump. They've got to figure out how to talk to the working class person again, regardless of their ethnicity.
So I don't want to give Chuck Todd too much credit, because he doesn't, who knows what he thinks it means to actually talk to the working class. But there does seem to be, I'm so skeptical. I'm so hesitant to give anybody any credit. But it does feel like notably different, at least in that baseline acknowledgement, than the an intense gaslighting we experienced from, 2017 through 2020.
Yeah, I mean, look, vindication's nice. I really would rather not have it and fascism. We could have just been vindicated after the first time they humiliated themselves with this totally avoidable loss to the most beatable real estate TV phony in history. I mean, amazing to watch him just walk over all those Republicans in 2016 and then all these Democrats ever since. And with nothing, just run as a peace candidate, and then you blow up Iranian generals, run as a populist, and then everyone in your cabinet is from Wall Street. Amazing stuff. But yeah, Chuck Todd, I mean, well, this to me is even more annoying than, the Harris team and the Pod Save cadre, which, is just execrable on a daily basis. Like Chuck Todd is normally just like your awful conservative corporate media mouthpiece. But surely, Senator Sanders, this will cost tax dollars. I didn't mention that when I said we should invade Iran last week, but I'm concerned about it now,
Right.
So he says, Democrats need to learn to talk to the working man again. Maybe you in the media could play a role in the working class feeling politically engaged. If you watch American, political or news TV, you immediately see why the country is so mentally messed up on politics. It's just corporations speaking to you through blondes, if it's Fox, through people in glasses, if it's the other networks. And it's just amazing stuff, because the only thing they'll say is, well, yes, but the Democrats, don't they need smart policy to win over all those suburban bombs and so forth from our electoral categorizations? They should really cut taxes and cut entitlements, charter schools that make poor people have a harder time getting their kids educated. That's very good. All these entities do is advocate for right-wing policies that, of course, end up advancing their own class interests. Again, these are institutions owned by the rich, of course. But then we can turn around and say, you should really be more populist here, as we are here on my investment for the wealthy program on CNN Business. Just the phoniness of it is amazing. But you are right, seeing so many figures. I mean, all these wretched right-wing hacks, and centrists especially, saying Sanders, maybe he had a point. Great. Now that we're this completely screwed, you guys are willing to say, oh, well, perhaps. Now that the door is sealed, you guys are willing to second guess yourselves. Great. That's nice. That's the person getting the medical diagnosis and saying, oh, maybe my doctor was right all these years. It's a annoying bro moment, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, now that the door is sealed, I think is a really nice way to put it. And it's part of what makes me feel this ambivalence, even about Senator Sanders, as he puts out completely correct and good statements like the one I read at the top of this episode. Or, a week or two ago, put out a statement that seemed to indicate that he might be supportive of a sort of a dirty break from the Democratic Party, that made the case for the Democratic Party kind of being in need of enormous reform that would perhaps lead us to believe it's not reformable, and the need for strong alternative parties and things like that. But then he answered a question more recently in an interview that clarified, I think, with John Nichols of The Nation, that no, he didn't actually mean he was supporting a dirty break. And so it does feel like when the door is closed, when there are no real opportunities for the Democratic Party to have power, people are willing to say a whole host of correct and progressive things. And I think that many progressives, people who were supportive of Bernie's campaigns, have now several cycles into having squad members elected and seeing how vocal they are about issues like Medicare for all when Democrats are out of power versus when they are in power, and when their criticisms rightly fall at the feet of centrist corporatists like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, how they become very, very quiet, are very skeptical of electoral politics and are very skeptical of what it even means for someone like Bernie Sanders or Chuck Todd or even people like James Carville at this point technically saying the right thing. And even having the Pod Save guys host Hassan Piker on to try to breathe some sort of legitimate left voice into their program and have some kind of mea culpa moment. And even all these conversations about how the left needs to have, they mean liberals need to have their own Joe Rogan, all seem to be missing this crucial point, which you describe in your book as the golden rule, which is that the investment theory of parties holds that parties are more accurately analyzed as blocks of major investors who coalesce to advance candidates representing their interests. In other words, follow the money. All of this seems to be a moot point because none of these people are willing to actually divest from this two-party apparatus, which has benefited widely from, and I would argue the whole point of them is to maintain this oligarchy. So then what next? And you have a pretty kind of compelling solution to what you think needs to happen next to radically transform the system at the end of your book.
Yeah, I do my best anyway. You are completely right, though. It is fairly painful to see how committed to the party Bernie and the surviving squad members are. Especially their support for Biden at the very end was so excruciating. Oh my God, that was worse than almost any episode. To me, in part, I kind of feel like when we look at political figures, people are actually serving in elected positions, I kind of, in my own mind, for my part, hold them to a different sort of standard than I would. It sort of depends on the role you're having. I'm a professor and I write books, so I can be principled and stand by positions and think them carefully and just stand by those. If you're in politics, even if you're like a really strong figure and you're consistent in your principles, and you have a strong political position, like it's a process of compromise and beshitting of most policies and most persons in it. I think it's rare to have anyone with Bernie's level of integrity. And, the man's flexible on it based on conditions, as we were just saying. At the same time, Sanders and AOC, recently we're talking about their Green New Deal for housing, like a real housing, public housing, of course, job construction and public housing provision plan that would have, that is what the Harris plan should have been if she wanted to actually win that election. But the U.S. system is so especially brutal because in so many other Western democracies, it's by our standards relatively easy to get an independent party established or to split off from one and gain parliamentary seats on that basis. Because our parties control their ballot lines and the country is just so privatized and capitalist and bureaucratic in all its institutions wall to wall, it's so rough for independent political parties in the United States. I'm definitely not opposed to exploring the idea, but I really do feel it would have to be led by a unique kind of figure, like a Sanders figure or something like that. So watching him seem to waver on this issue has been, a suspenseful process, I would say, over the last few weeks. To me, these figures, they're in the ugly mud fight. So if they make some ugly stances that I think can't be justified, I still want them to be the ones who are, making advances and getting their policies out. I always say these people can't be Noam Chomsky in a Senate seat. But at the same time,
Why is that?
I'm not a political scientist, but to me, it's just when you're in this system, like, you're in Washington, D.C., and you are the elect, even if you really are, like AOC, coming out of a fairly real working class background and origin story, just every day the pressure's on you to identify as more of a cool insider with a lanyard who does TV and is powerful and passes laws, of course. I think just the tendency to create that elitism is very strong. And you always have people who are more principled and kind of resist it. I personally kind of think that is a stronger dynamic than we maybe sometimes appreciate. But
isn't that an argument against for third party formation, though? Because I don't disagree. And I don't think AOC would disagree. There was Ryan Grimm, AOC, and I did a podcast at The Intercept back in the day about exactly these pressures with a former congressman, I think from North or South Carolina, I always forget, where he was basically warning AOC against those pressures and explaining how much of your time is spent fundraising and what it means for your kind of political priorities to be under that sort of pressure and all of that. I think that is clear. The problem is that is a feature of what it means to belong to one of these two corporate parties. Isn't that an argument against believing that substantive change can be achieved from the inside? I mean, that's the counter argument.
Completely. I mean, that along with all the other arguments, like watching half of the squad get picked off in their primaries, not even by the traditional socialist enemy, the Chamber of Commerce, but by the friggin' ethnic cleansing lobby. Like, that's been difficult to watch as well. Just at every moment, all the incentives and all the structures are against like real participation. And again, it does speak, though, to like you see a real difference in the parties on this basis, because remember, it's just the Democratic Party base that is any kind of obstacle or threat to wealth. And, the ruling class, I write about it in the book, the Republican base wants these guys' taxes cut and maybe tariffs that disrupt their business, but, it'll still favor their interests. They'll, get rid of or weaken the National Labor Relations Board and OSHA and the EPA. But it's Democrats who, if the base, if the party reflects the base, it'll be bad for them, because that's like a Bernie type of program. So to me, there's like a really asymmetrical feature there. Like, the right wing has a political home in this country. In fact, it gets two homes. We get a little embarrassing room in the back of one of those parties. It's just insanely difficult in the United States. If you look at the state ballot access laws, I mean, you are obviously familiar with, but it's just a stunning thing here in my state of Washington. And, I'm from Indiana originally. I mean, try getting on these ballots. The entities that can do it are ones that manage to have some basis in wealth to give them that, institutional form and some continuity of planning. And primarily the Libertarian Party. Very annoying to see them on every ballot and not at least also the Party of Liberation and Socialism or something like that. But again, the PSL struggles, who, God bless them. I mean, it's just insanely uphill battle all the time. It's so expensive. Collecting signatures is arduous. The state parties, often the figures like state auditors that go through those petitions belong to one of the parties and just have a party interest in disqualifying signatures. So I'm a big fan of doing independent political organizing. It's just the U.S. political system is such a unique, capitalist-dominated castration of the public will that I feel like personally, I don't know if I necessarily see the exact way for us to cope with that. As you said, what I talk about at the end of the book is more of at least at the beginning, outside of politics strategy for the left, focusing more on building up the labor movement. And I wouldn't quite say we have a resurgence yet of labor, but we're at least having a renaissance. We have very impressive new national leadership for several of the major, labor internationals that have been doing a lot of, I think, very valuable work popularizing a left-wing approach to unionism. And the figures like Shauna Bryant at the Teamsters, who spoke at the Republican convention and who tried to get Harris interested, and Harris didn't invite him. I mean, there's no basis for providing any sort of support for Trump, but I don't think it's wrong for labor to at least suggest that it has other options to get the Democrats to stop taking them for granted. But anyway, I would say a really rejuvenated labor movement. We can continue to build on the modest but real victories we've been having for public unions in Wisconsin just yesterday with that court ruling, with the hundreds of organized, although not yet recognized Starbucks shops A lot of wildcat strikes among the teachers in the last few years. And, some organizing victories by the UAW that are very impressive. And, our one Staten Island organized Amazon warehouse hanging in there. It's great to see some of that. If you have a bigger labor movement, then you can support. You have more popular organization that can compete with those big investment blocks that I described with, as you said, that golden rule idea earlier. Labor allows people to compete with those giant investment blocks. That's how we got that New Deal. So to me, I would have a vision of a much larger rejuvenated labor movement that's able to to entertain general strikes on a scale that are real and that will let us support a labor or socialist based presence, whether that's through the wretched Democrats somehow or with an independent party somehow. And what I imagine then would be if you have enough political position to pass some real socialist legislation, like some kind of expropriation of an industry, backed by a sit down strike in the industry to make it actually occur. Like to me, these are, obviously the biggest lifts that occur in history. But to me, this is the kind of path I think is like a little more promising in the near term, considering just how twisted and purchased and caged our actual proper political system is.
So it was the expropriation point that really caught my eye that I was alluding to. I mean, God bless the labor point and the second to last chapter, I believe, which is all about the role that labor has to play here. But I was very intrigued by you taking this a step farther. Let me just read one paragraph here. You write, so inevitably, socialism would require the end of private ownership of the productive economy. That means expropriation, taking these assets away from their present hyper-rich owners. Much like the slave economy in the 19th century or local fire stations in the 20th, these assets should be taken away from the rich and run through different forms of public management accountable to a democratic process. Everyone likes those historic expropriations, and now we just need a final great one to end all the endless nightmares and objectively intolerable social outcomes this book has reviewed. And on fairness, we haven't talked as much about these things as in our conversation as you do in the book, but you spend chapters outlining the excesses of the very, very rich in terms of the sheer wealth they have, the super yachts, the climate impacts of the same, the lies and cheating to get into school and to maintain these institutions that reproduce wealth hierarchies and on and on and on. So by the time you get to this, you've really, I think, earned this call for expropriation in a way that the naked ear might think, well, that's maybe a bridge too far. That's saying a lot. Maybe not people in this audience who are probably immediately on board, but a more broader audience might be saying, well, that sounds like the crazy sort of things that billionaires warn us against when they're telling us that socialism is a bad idea. So why do you think that expropriation is required to have a meaningful step forward here?
Yeah. So, yeah, great. Thank you. That's, to me, is kind of the crucial thing. And as I sort of frame it in the book, it's kind of the story of, like, in the US, the story of the New Deal. This country was, is one of the great industrial revolutions, and you get Rockefellers and Carnegies who monopolize whole sectors of the economy and just dominate it politically. And then you have this giant wave of just incredible sacrifices and work building up the huge labor movement, mainly around the CIO, of course, in those days, and getting this gigantic labor movement together that was able to make real demands of the political system and even get like real reforms, like, say, Social Security or the National Labor Relations Act, major institutionalized achievements. And it's all, of course, on the back of unknown labor organizers from the Depression era who lived in conditions we can't imagine and sacrificed so we could have what remains of the New Deal. But crucially, when that New Deal happened, it's all very important reforms and going into that Great Society era after the war with Medicare and later things like OSHA and the EPA, like incredibly valuable and important. But just like social democracy in Western Europe at the same time, it mostly stopped at expropriation. Like, we're going to tax the rich very heavily with progressive taxation, and we're going to allow labor organizing, which brings a lot of redistributed income and over time wealth down into like the working and indeed middle classes of the economy. But we never like expropriated these people, So at the height of the New Deal and Great Society programs, like in the 60s and 70s, for that wealthiest 10% of households, their share of the national income never goes below 33%. So they stay quite rich all through it. And especially they kept what we mentioned earlier, their ownership of the productive economy. They kept the stock and all the ownership that confers over the great corporate world. So all those oil refineries and giant agricultural tracts of land and the railroads, and today the data centers and huge warehouses to distribute goods. Those things are private property. They belong sometimes to individuals and families. Like you do see that at the highest size, but usually they're corporate property, But because those shares, as we said, are mostly owned by that very rich, wealthy 1%, like that is their corporate property. And because we left them in possession of that productive property and the wealth that it spins off over time, they were then in a position in the 70s to start planning for supporting fringe right-wing intellectuals like the Mount Pelerin Society and Fred Hayek and Milton Friedman and guys like that, to create an intellectual rationale and to build policy around when we kind of use our ruling class wealth to come back. And I mean, that's the Reagan Revolution. That's neoliberalism. Like neoliberalism has dominated our lives. People of our age, like that is our lifespan, is this era. And why did it happen? Because we never took these wealthy people out of their position of social influence where they could, get up a candidate like Reagan and get him to the governor's mansion in California and then eventually get him into high office and create all the disasters we've been living through ever since, So if we had expropriated that wealth, how would they be in a position to, get us Thatcher and Reagan and so on? So I would say it's the expropriation is the line, in my view, between social democracy and something we could call really socialism. Now, what you then do with those firms is a really important subject. Usually in socialism, we talk about worker control of the means of production. So some form of, people talk about co-ops or any other form of worker-based decision-making. Through a lot of federation, though, of course, we got to remember how many hundreds of steps products come through. Phones, cars, so many companies contribute parts, and socialist workers would have to coordinate that themselves instead of letting supply and demand and relative prices do it. When you've built up an economy this rich, that gives people a lot more freedom. We have a lot more democracy, obviously, and let us have work lives that don't drain us energetically. And we could actually maybe build products we really need, like renewable energy, rather than quadrupling down on fossil fuels. So to me, that expropriation is kind of an important line that we should just have in our minds in terms of what stepping beyond the important measures of social democracy into really radical change would look like.
I like the idea. You have to expropriate the wealth of billionaires or else they use the money to found the economics department at the University of Chicago and ruin our lives. That being said, we are now looking at down the barrel of this Trump administration, where you have a very significant number of billionaires, including Elon Musk, and people like Vivek Ramaswamy and Peter Thiel and David Sachs and the like, all seeming to have a very close relationship with the Trump campaign. Elon tweeting out his desires for cabinet positions and the like. And it's the opposite of the democratically controlled, expropriated industries that you've just finished describing. And I wonder if you have a take on what we can expect, especially given that you do have this background and also writing specifically about the tech industry and the role of that particular segment of the oligarchy on our society.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was one feature of the first Trump administration. And now the new one is the unpredictability. And business, they really, the market's going crazy now. They love a Republican administration coming in. Their taxes will come down. Their regulations will be loosened reliably. Trump mainly governed as a conservative in the first instance. We'll find out this time. But business hates the uncertainty. Is he really going to start that big of a trade war that'll actually threaten corporate profitability and hurt the markets? And in his first term, Trump, would threaten these things and then walk them back later, presumably when whichever Treasury Secretary that he was churning through said, this is going to scare the markets. You sure about this? And then Trump would go, oh, I like the markets. We want them to be bigger. So he would not do that. The tariffs that we're talking about are pretty gigantic, a 20% wall to wall and a 60% on China. If those numbers were visited, it would mean a return to inflation. And that's, I think, if they were to go that far, I think once that eventuates, they will back away from that, maybe too late. In the first time around, a lot of the time, the tariff threats were just a negotiating cudgel Trump put tariffs on Mexico and Canada and then renegotiated NAFTA. So I imagine more things like that rather than just putting up huge tariffs and leaving them there, except, of course, on China, where Biden decided that those tariffs would become bipartisan policy. And almost none of those tariffs on Chinese exports and sanctions on their tech products and on their exports from different parts of the country, none of those came down. So we're going to see higher prices because of these trade conflicts, especially because this is always a shocking idea to Americans. Like, other countries will retaliate. They retaliated in 2017 and 2018 when Trump started putting those huge tariff tax up. And because our economy is so big and powerful, we can laugh it off more than they can. But putting these kind of tariffs on Chinese goods, we put 100% tariff on imports of Chinese cars in this country, doubling their price, essentially. If we do that with iPhones, people will not stand for it. No one cares about Chinese cars in this country. People are barely aware of BYD. But if your iPhone suddenly doubles in price, people will care. Like, to me, Trump's evil political instincts have historically been pretty good just about how things are going to play. And that's why he wants to play down abortion, especially a national ban, and talk more about how I'm going to benefit you economically. Like, he has good, evil, slimy instincts like that. So my impression is, as these trade wars make the economic performance deteriorate, then they'll be backed off from or compromised down in the first place. But it's just, this is what, if you read the Wall Street Journal every day, like I have to do, the big thing business is saying is, well, I like all the specific proposals, but not the trade war. What will happen? And just the uncertainty is what everyone comments on. Say what you will about the Bush administration, but it was very clear what the policy proposals were going to be and what they were going to try to do. And even with these cabinet picks, we have, mostly, again, establishmentarian figures. I really feel that Lutner and the new Treasury Secretary will tell Trump, if you put these huge tariffs in place, the market's going to take a real dive and people aren't going to like it. On the other hand, Elon Musk, the dumbest billionaire, including Donald Trump, has said on Twitter, X. He said on X that the economy will be bad for a while, but then get better. So I wonder if these guys are deluded enough to purposefully cause a recession. I kind of doubt it, but with this administration, we'll all be surprised together, I guess.
They do seem, Musk has been really elevating and supporting heavy MLA. It's seemingly undeterred by the 300% inflation or whatever they're experiencing in Argentina. They do seem to believe that it's going to be rough for a while, but in the long term it will be good philosophy is the right one. But I think your point, Donald Trump's sort of evil pragmatism is right, that he doesn't necessarily care about the long-term outcome if he is being maligned in the short term. And I think whereas Elon Musk might have that risk tolerance, it remains to be seen whether or not Donald Trump does.
Yeah, that's a great point. And whereas Elon Musk is so used to being seen as a weirdo and a extremely divorced cringe bonker and so on, I think it's made him more inured to criticism. And then also he reacts more psychotically when he gets power, like those his famous poses at the Trump rallies and so on. Sure, just great to look at those. But Trump is famous for his thin skin and for being media obsessed. Musk has just built up his own media, so he only hears how great he is. Trump, wants to be on the major TV networks being talked about how great the economy is and his numbers are good. So it's definitely, you got, contradictions, as we say in economics about capitalism, and major contradictions in the incoming team and Trump himself and some of his policy goals. So I think this is just why the business press right now is kind of scratching their heads about what exactly will happen, because you just have so much less visibility into the planning, such as it is in this administration.
Yeah, ultimately, I'm always saying this. Trump is a classic Gemini. He's social. He wants to be liked. And so much of his behavior can be understood through this lens.
That is great. There's so many Trump critiques. I've never heard it done through astrological sign. Wow, that's fantastic. I like that.
I did an episode at some point last year where I had an astrologer come on to give his take on the election and to give a better understanding of the candidates. It is kind of tongue in cheek, obviously, but holy smokes, did that divide the audience? So,
yeah, that
I know I'm on borrowed time with this particular line of attack. Yes.
It's polarizing material.
Right. Well, Rob, I really appreciate you joining us today. I want to give you a last chance to kind of talk about anything from the book that I might have missed, or make a pitch for why people should look into Mastering the Universe or any of your other works.
Yeah, thanks, Brianna. I appreciate it. I would just say if you would like to be very conversant on this subject and actually just have like some real knowledge on it, there's a short chapter on the statistical background for it, but then we have a very long, very juicy chapter on the outrageous lifestyle of some of these people, chapter on the complete bullshit arguments justifying their wealth, little chapter on climate there just to connect to that issue, which is a big deal, of course, for all of us. Just say it's a small little book. I really try as an economist to make it not completely boring and kind of funny to read. Nathan Robinson, whom we love, said at one point, said I was the America's funniest economist, which I feel is a very achievable goal. I feel like I appreciate that, but I feel like I did earn that. It's an easy goal in life. So, it's the holiday season coming up. If you've got a loved one who you'd like to inform or just troll harder, this book could be something you'll get a kick out of.
Yeah, Professor Larson, I was actually thinking as I was reading this, I did engage in a little classic Thanksgiving debating over the last week. And I found myself thinking, gosh, there's certain people in my life whom I love who would really benefit from reading something like this instead of making arguments to me that made me want to gag myself with the wishbone. So
yeah,
thank you for this.
Oh, that's great. Appreciate that.
Yeah. All right. Professor Larson, where can people find you on the internet and beyond?
Yes, thanks. I'm Ironic Professor on all platforms. So that is the handle. You can find me there. Every day, I like to look at the business press and just take some things that are behind the journal's paywall and put them out where people can see them on X or Blue Sky or wherever you consume your feed. So folks can check that out.
All right. Again, the book is Mastering the Universe by Rob Larson. You can get it where books are sold. Thanks for tuning in. As always, you can get an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast on Mondays at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and get free clips of those episodes over on YouTube. And of course, our Thursday free episodes are out anywhere you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. And as always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.